All right, so I want to get into this movie, The Cove. I knew the existence of this movie since 2009 when it came out. Always thought this was a hate crime in disguise, and not particularly a hate crime against Japanese people who who hunt these dolphins, but a hate crime against Asian Americans, particularly Asian American males. And why I call this a hate crime is the way that the movie is set up. There's even a scene of Hayden Panettiere,
The Dolphins.
Hayden Panettiere crying while these dolphins are being slaughtered. But what people don't know about the slaughtering of dolphins is they've been doing this since forever in the Faroe Islands. There's blonde-haired, blue-eyed people in the Faroe Islands. They hunt these dolphins, they kill these dolphins. It's an annual event for them as much as it is for the Japanese. And it's a family event. You see little kids, little children, blonde hair, blue-eyed boys and girls out there stabbing dolphins. And it was never shown. It was never shown in this movie, and it was never made made as an existence in this movie that white people also did this. And it's always been something that got to me, because this film did not affect the Japanese. All right, the Japanese, they're gonna do what they're gonna do. They know what they do. They didn't affect the Japanese. What it did was it did affect Asian Americans, particularly Asian American males in America. In fact, this film actually contributed to the destruction of a whole entire generation of Asian American males because of how it was set up, because of the subject matter. Now, granted, this film did get a lot of pushback from, well, some foot pushback from Japanese people. They didn't like the fact that this film was put out there, and it portrayed them particularly negatively without evening any of this out, as far as portraying the other side of white people doing this negatively. And as I said again, having Hayden, a young, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white Hayden Panettiere, going out there crying her eyes out. And mind you, this film was all over the mainstream media. I remember watching this on ET. I remember watching this on Entertainment Tonight. I remember watching this on a bunch of other mainstream news outlet, with Hayden just absolutely crying and depicting the Japanese slaughtering the Japanese males. And it's always the Japanese males, right? It's always the Asian males that they go after, slaughtering the dolphins. And I remember, obviously I was younger back then, I remember the negative impact that this movie had on me. And I knew after watching segments of this movie and trailers and in these TV news magazines, I knew that it was going to have a really negative effect on Asian Americans, particularly Asian American males as a whole. And the main problem with this is they portray all these white people as the saviors of these helpless dolphins. Everybody who actually, helped to save the dolphins are white, and then the bad guys were the Japanese, right? The Asian men who actually killed these dolphins. But this exists. This exists with the same horror, with the same with the same amount of blood and gore and everything that you could imagine, with blonde-haired, blue-eyed people in Denmark, in the Faroe Islands. So why didn't, if Stephen Fisher, and he is he committed a hate crime with this movie. He committed a hate crime with this movie. This movie is nothing more than a propaganda hit piece against Asian American males, particularly young Asian American males growing up, and how they're viewed, how they view themselves, etc., because this gets shown in middle school, this gets shown in high schools, this gets shown as an education piece in schools everywhere in this country, and this movie should be labeled as much as a hate crime as a Birth of a Nation, because it has the same amount of impact as any racist movie would have against a certain group. All right, it would still be a negative movie if it was the Japanese who actually were the only people who went out there and hunt dolphins and whales, but the white people of Europe do that too. Some of the white people in Europe do that too. The Faroe Islands, the Denmark, the Vikings, they've hunted whales, they've killed whales, they've used whales, they've hunted dolphins, they've killed dolphins, they use dolphins, and yet Fisher Stevens, who cares so much about these dolphins, haven't put out a Cove 2 depicting the whites killing these dolphins. He hasn't put out a Cove 2 with a white male and a machete just hacking off dolphins alive, killing off dolphins, their families, etc., and that's also a point that annoyed, that just crawls at me, because there's a scene, I believe there's a scene in this quote-unquote racist, quote-unquote documentary, but it is a racist propaganda piece that depicts a family of dolphins getting slaughtered by Japanese males. However, you guys could look on YouTube, you guys could go Google Faroe Islands, and you guys will see nothing but white people, a sea of white people who do this they do this all the time, but there's like a big yearly hunt of whales, of dolphins, and it's a family event. They get their sons, they get their daughters, they get their grandchildren, and it's a rite of passage for them. It's a rite of passage for them. All right, so Stephen Fisher, I've tried to contact this guy for him to man up on this hate crime, because it has had a huge negative effect. It has had a huge negative psychic impact on Asian Americans. And I've always said that 1995 to 2017, Hollywood essentially culturally terrorized Asian Americans. Whatever it was that Asian Americans built up, the image that Asian Americans built up prior to that, decades of building up an image of respectable people, of dignified people, of hardworking people, of smart people, that image of people who, there was even a part Asian American Superman on TV in '93. All right, there was Dustin Nguyen, who spoke perfect English on 21 Jump Street. Asian Americans were, prior to 1995, included in the American cultural fabric. And after 1995, from 1995 to 2017, that entire period was nothing but stereotypes, ugly, negative, racist stereotypes from Hollywood, particularly of Asian American males, that essentially destroyed a whole entire generation of Asian American males. And this movie contributed so much to the destruction of that image, and it is such an awful hate crime that I am amazed that nobody, that it's a shame that there aren't Asian American civil rights movements that have gone out and essentially canceled this, but not just canceled, but everybody who's associated with this movie, anybody who's associated with any kind of negative portrayals of Asian American males from 1995 to 2017 should be prosecuted for hate crimes. Fisher Stevens should be prosecuted for hate crimes, for making this movie, for producing this movie. Instead, he got an Academy Award. It is such absolute garbage, all right? BS, absolute BS, that somebody, particularly a Jew whose people have been victimized and who constantly talk about anti-Semitism, who constantly talk about hate crimes against Jews, etc., etc. Yet these Jewish people and blacks, these Jewish people and blacks will go out their way to use the media as their own propaganda tool for their own personal agenda. All right? And if you guys feel the same way as I do about this movie, and you guys should just put it out on Twitter and everywhere else that Fisher Stevens committed a hate crime. He committed a hate crime with this movie. He committed it's not just a plain hate crime. It's a culturally terroristic hate crime that persists in celluloid, that persists in high schools, and that persists in middle schools, where this movie is constantly shown to kids and making them feel a certain negative way about themselves if they're Asian, particularly Asian American males, and particularly about them as Asians from other people. It's an absolute disgusting piece of propaganda that not only should be canceled and totaled, but every person who actually had a hand in this, particularly Fisher Stevens, should be prosecuted for a hate crime.